Good evening. Good evening, everyone. If you could please come in and grab a seat. For those that are watching this remotely, please know that you'll be on mute for the course of the evening. And if you have questions, please send your questions into the chat box and we'll try to get the questions answered. Also, for our audience that's here tonight, if you do have a question, I will likely repeat the question for those in the audience and also for those that might not have heard the question. So good evening. My name is Joel Arrighetti, and I am co-chair of the 2023 Federation Annual Campaign, along with Seth Greenberg, my co-chair, who's in the back. I also have the distinct pleasure, along with my wife and 5 or 6 other couples, to serve as co-chairs of our community mission to Israel. And tonight we're going to talk a little bit about it, share some information, answer a few questions, and help prepare for our trip in April. We are delighted to see so many of you here in person, and for those of you that are on Zoom, thank you for attending. For many of you, this might be your first time to Israel. Others have been 2 or 3 times, and a handful of folks have been to Israel more than a dozen times. And what everyone knows who's been to Israel is that each experience is different. In our community mission, there will be over 200 attendees. One thing we've done different this year is we've offered those that are in attendance the opportunity to select what I like to refer to as sort of a major and a minor. 2 or 3 days of this particular activity and a few days of some other activities. All along the entire journey, there will be activities Okay. If the I apologize if it's there's a little bit of feedback. We may be able to turn the feedback down, and I apologize for that. Tonight, we're going to have 2 guests with us tonight, and I'll introduce them shortly, and they'll be speaking a little bit more in detail about logistics and about our time in Israel. You will all receive in the coming weeks some information for our Israeli operator, Makor. That's the administrator or our tour guide. Everyone who has selected will receive their first choice. We have combined geopolitical and the technology tours. We've eliminated a couple of tours only because lack of interest. And we regret that, but we needed to have a critical mass of people in order to get a bus, in order to get experts to speak in those areas. And those that have been eliminated were Tikkun Olam, spirituality, and land and Torah scholars. We've selected, or we've identified second choices for people that chose one of those. We have a final orientation on March the 20th, 7:30 p.m. at the Selig Center in Midtown, Atlanta. I would encourage everyone in Atlanta to attend that in person. There will be valuable information disseminated at that meeting. And for those that are outside of Atlanta, you will have a Zoom opportunity to participate. If you have yet to forward your air travel details, please send them to Barry Schwartz. Barry, would you please raise your hand? Many of you have spoken with Barry. A lot of you know Barry. Barry's in the back. Barry is one of our facilitators. And for those that, well, thank you. For those that you have requested a pre or post journey hotel reservation, please get that information to Barry as soon as possible if you haven't already identified it. Information about your pre and post journey holiday travel plans will be forwarded back to you if you're making them through Makor and through Barry. We want to make sure that information is accurate as quickly as possible. Also, in the coming weeks, we're going to be forwarding to everyone an email with a liability waiver and release. That's the lawyer fine print. And in that release is a permission to share with the attendees a list of who's going. so that we might know that some of the folks that aren't here tonight, you may find out your neighbor, fellow congregant, friend, or business associate might be going on the trip. So please, when you have that opportunity, check the box that says, I give my permission to share the fact that you're going on this trip with other people going on the trip. All right. At this time, I'd like to introduce Rabbi Josh Heller. I want to thank B'nai Torah for hosting us. Many of you know Rabbi Heller, the senior rabbi here at B'nai Torah. He has been at Congregation B'nai Torah since 2004. He is a community leader. He is a champion of all things Federation and many things Israel. Rabbi, thank you.
Thank you. I am very excited to be spending over a week with you in Israel. That's almost as long as some of my sermons last, so you'll get the same kind of experience. And B'nai Torah, we are very, very pleased to be able to host. We see ourselves as really want to be partners in everything worthwhile that the community does to facilitate people coming together, which is one of the main things that Federation seeks to do. And so we're happy to be a partner in that. And just a word of Torah since, we're here. This week, we're reading Parshat Truma, which talks about Jews coming together, the entire Jewish people, to create a central place of focus. For them, it was the tabernacle. It was a portable shrine that they could carry with them wherever they went, because they were on their way to the land of Israel, and it was going to take them 40 years. There was not yet a direct flight at that time. We can think about that story in two ways as we prepare for this journey. One is to be grateful to have a land of Israel, to have a place where we can turn and focus, but also to understand that in some sense, we carry Israel with us like the tabernacle. Wherever we go, there's a little bit of Israel we carry with us. So we're going to go for a week, 8 days, 9 days. And yes, we will bring back tchotchkes, bring an extra bag, but we will also bring back a little bit of Israel in our hearts with us. And we will carry that with us as we try to create community here. So as important as it is for us to learn about Israel, to explore Israel, the inspiration we bring it's not just a trip, it is a journey that brings us, that continues even when we've returned home. So I hope that we can think about it in that way, and that we can really come into this looking at what is it that we take with us, that we carry with us even beyond our journey. So thank you for being here tonight. Thank you everyone at home on Zoom. And we are delighted to host and to learn what's going to happen on this trip.
Thank you, Rabbi. We thought it would be helpful to bring a couple of subject matter experts to us to give us a little bit of an appetizer about some of the things that's in store for us in less than 8 weeks. And I want to introduce a colleague of mine, and I call him a colleague of mine because we're truly partners. Rich Walter is the Chief Program Officer and Grant Maker at Federation. As the chair of the campaign, it's my privilege to work with Rich and help educate people in our community about the many, many things that Federation does. We're very fortunate that Rich came to us from the Center of Israel Education at Emory University. Rich has been a lifelong Jewish professional, highly educated at Brandeis University, and Rich will be in discussion with Eli Sperling. Eli Dr. Eli Sperling is with the Israel Institute Teaching Fellows at the School of Public and International Affairs at the University of Georgia. And Eli has conducted a vast amount of research, traveled all over the world, including Israel, and he is going to be speaking with us a little bit about some of the things that we can expect and a little bit about what's going on with Israel. It's going to be in a little bit of a discussion Q&A format. Rich and Eli will be talking for a little bit, and at the end of their remarks, we'll be entertaining questions. And as I mentioned earlier in my remarks, if you've got a question towards the end and we have time, I'll call on you, ask your question. Please make it a question, not a statement. I'll repeat the question so people at home can hear it, and then one of our speakers will respond. And with that, on with the program.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you, Rabbi Heller. It's a privilege, not just to be here with everyone tonight, but I also am really looking forward to the opportunity to travel with all of you in just a few short weeks. Just a little bit of what we're going to cover. I'm going to speak for a few minutes really about two things. One, why Israel is so important to us as the Jewish people, but also how that plays out in the day-to-day work at Jewish Federation of Greater Atlanta. Then I'm going to bring out my friend Eli Sperling, who's going to talk a little bit more. I know all of you have been following the news about some of what's happening in contemporary Israeli politics, with also a little bit of a look at some demography and current demography of the Jewish world. I'm actually going to talk a little bit about some historic demography as well. So, and then we'll have questions, and no question is off limits or out of bounds. We may not answer it, but we'll certainly take the question as well. So I just want to share that, you know, a connection and a relationship to Israel is really at the core and heart of what Federation does on a regular day-to-day basis. Every year, the dollars that we raise in our annual campaigns, we invest obviously all throughout Greater Atlanta, but many people may not realize that about $3 million through our investments in grants and other programs are invested in overseas opportunities. And of course, the bulk of those dollars are invested in Israel. This funding is guided by really a community goal that we have to provide experiences and discussions that help Jews better understand and deepen their relationship to Israel and the global Jewish community, and also to improve the health and well-being of vulnerable populations, Jewish populations throughout the world, and especially in Israel. And how do we do this? We really do this in a couple of different ways. First is we are blessed that we have a special partnership relationship with the city of Yokneam and the surrounding communities of the Megiddo Regional Council. On our trip in just a few short weeks, we are all going to have an opportunity to spend time in that region. Well, what does it mean to have a partnership region? A partnership region is not just a place for us to direct our philanthropy or our charity or our grants. It really is a partnership. So that each year, our schools in our community, many of our day schools, several of our congregational schools, do joint learning with schools in Yokneam, Megiddo. So we are creating meaningful connections between students. Each year, Federation, through our partnership with the Jewish Agency for Israel, brings what we call shinshinim, young Israelis who are between high school and their army service, to spend a year working and volunteering here in our community. And we specifically target young people who grew up in our partnership region. Just recently, a few weeks ago, a delegation of educators from our community school spent 7 days in our partnership region, learning with their counterparts, understanding how the Israeli educational system works, and taking back strategies and content for our community. When we are on our trip, our partnership region is literally working to create host family opportunities for each one of us so that we'll be able to actually have dinner at the home of members of the community in Yokneam, Megiddo. They also care for our young people. Anytime one of our school trips or birthright from this community goes to Israel, they spend meaningful time in Yokneam, Megiddo. So this helps strengthen the connection. This helps our community identify with a real human being that lives in Israel, whether it's a pen pal like my daughter had when she was a student at the Epstein School, or a human that comes here like our shinshinim. So that we're working to do that with our partnership community. We also work to strengthen the connection from our community with the broader Jewish world, and especially Israel. We are fortunate that we are now in our 3rd year of what we call our Gap Year Fellowship. Over the last 2 years, Federation has supported 53 high school graduates to spend a year before college on a gap year in Israel, where they've developed their leadership skills, where they've strengthened their connection to Israel and the Jewish people, and where they come back prepared for life on campus and facing any, hopefully more of the positive Israel stuff, but also prepared to deal with some of the negative. We bring our shinshinim, as I mentioned. We support our community schools. We are partners with the Route 1 initiative, which is a national initiative for teens. giving them a $3,000 voucher to go. We support Onward through Hillels of Georgia and Birthright. We want to help people in our community have an Israel experience because we know how meaningful and impactful it is, not just for their connection to Israel, but for their connection to their Judaism and their Jewish identity. And of course, we believe in the Jewish teaching that all Israel is responsible for one another, and we ensure that we are caring for the vulnerable populations in Israel, whether it's at-risk youth in our partnership program, the Yemen Ord Youth Village, or it's caring for Ukrainian refugees who have made their way to Israel due to the war in Ukraine, making sure that there's camps for their kids and employment opportunities for the women and men who come, or the Ethiopian community in our partnership region. We want to make sure that we are meeting the needs and helping our partners in Israel, just as we care for the vulnerable Jews in our community, care for the vulnerable Jews in Israel. I want to share two quick stories that highlight this impact from both sides of the coin. Then I'm going to get into a little bit of why this matters and a little bit of historical context before I'll turn it over to Eli. I mentioned Yemen Ord, the youth village, which takes in at-risk youth from different parts of not just Israel, but around the world. A story from this past summer when the school really worked to help close some of the educational gaps that students who were coming to them were facing because of their backgrounds, and that they created a summer camp program for 120 9th to 11th graders. When most Israeli kids were on their summer vacation, these kids were doing an intensive education program aimed at improving their performance in school. They spent their mornings studying and their afternoons having fun and a chance to rest so they could return to the classroom the following morning. The camp had an added benefit because these are kids from at-risk families, because they were learning, because they were preparing for school, they weren't getting in trouble in their communities. And this is all supported by an investment that Jewish Federation makes every year. The youths were paired with private tutors, and they all completed a variety of different projects. Every student who took this course passed their matriculation exams when they got back into school in the fall. So this is important. This is what our creation and our investment works. We may never meet some of these kids, but we are helping ensure a strong future for Israel and the Jewish people. A second story I want to share. I mentioned our Gap Year initiative. One of the programs that we created 2 years ago in partnership with the Jewish Agency for Israel and in partnership with our partners in Yokneam, Megiddo, I mentioned how we bring Shinshinim here for a gap year. Well, we want to create an experience where a high school graduate before college not just spends a gap year at one of the many excellent programs that we offer, but can have an opportunity to spend a gap year volunteering and working in Yokneam. This year, Amit Rao is the second time we've had a Shinshin IL, is what we call this program, who lives in Yokneam, works in the community, volunteers in the high school and with the youth groups. Just this week, Amit wrote, "One of my favorite elements of being a Shinshinit is the connections I can make with locals. Whether I meet a student in my school volunteering or talk to a leader in one of the youth movements, every meeting is much more than a coincidence. On weekends, I often have Shabbat dinner with my host families, some of whom are my students in my schools. I am so lucky that the community of Yokneam Megiddo has welcomed me with open arms these past few months. I can't wait to share my experiences back home, and I hope to reunite with these many connections in future visits to Israel." So why does this matter? Why is this important? Why do we want to instill a sense of Jewish peoplehood and a strong connection to Israel, not just in our young people, but for those of you who it's your first time, or if you've been many times, to reignite that flame, that passion? One of the activities that I used to do when I was at Center for Israel Education with teens and teachers was a look back at what was happening in the world in the middle of the 19th century. At that time, most of the world's only 4.75 million Jews lived in Eastern and Southern Europe. Their lives were defined by persecution in the form of anti-Jewish legislation, the denial of basic rights, and of course, their existence was punctuated by 3 waves of violent pogroms, organized attacks against their communities that took place between 1881 and 1917. What was the response at this time? How did Jewish life change? Well, you're not going to be surprised. This was Jewish life, even if it was a much smaller demographic slice than we're looking at now, that there was no single response or agreement on what the future for the Jewish people should be. In fact, the New York Times wrote in June 4th of 1882, the Jews of Europe are debating the question of which direction immigrants from Russia should take, the West to America or the Southeast to Palestine. But not surprising, not everyone even advocated for immigration. Shimon Dubnow, the famed Russian Jewish historian, wrote in 1898, the Jews as inhabitants of Europe since ancient times demand equal political and civil rights as members of a historic nationality united by a common culture. They demand as much autonomy as is appropriate for any nationality to develop freely. The Jew who lives a life of peace and quiet in his fatherland can well be an English, French, or German patriot and can at the same time be true and devoted to the Jewish community. Sounds like something that we could say today. In the shadow of these developments, Theodor Herzl, the father of modern Zionism or political Zionism, wrote a pamphlet called The Jewish State in 1896. In it, he said, no one can deny the gravity of the situation of the Jews. Wherever they live in perceptible numbers, they are more or less persecuted. What did Herzl proclaim? He did proclaim immigration, but unlike Dubnow, he didn't say we should fight for autonomy and our national rights in the lands we live. He proposed something that wasn't necessarily new, but he politicized it and created a movement. He proposed the following: let the sovereignty be granted us over a portion of the globe large enough to satisfy the rightful requirements of a nation. The rest we shall manage for ourselves. I won't get into the fact that he didn't specifically name the land of Israel at this moment, but the fact that it was Herzl who gave this impetus and created a political movement that was able to move Zionism forward. Herzl also believed and advocated in the Jewish state that no matter our differences, no matter where we lived, we are one people. At this time, there's a moment of major demographic growth. The Jewish population goes from, in a very short period of time, from that 4.75 million in the middle of the 19th century to 16 million on the eve of World War II and the Holocaust. Rapid growth, modernity really helped with that growth. So what did the majority of Jews do? They were suffering persecution. They were suffering violent attacks. There's calls to leave. What do you think? What did the majority do? Anybody? Yell it out. The majority stayed. The majority, like Dubnow, stayed. Many tried to alter Judaism, change it, modernize it. So around this time, we have the birth of some of the movements of Judaism that we know today, a little bit earlier, but in the same general time period. We know they stayed because the sad fact of the 6 million who perished in the Holocaust, of that 16 million Jews. But for those who left, for those who decided to vote with their feet, most did not choose to go to the land of Israel. Where did most decide to come? Here. In fact, it's probably when many of our parents, grandparents, and great-grandparents came to this country. Between 1881 and 1928, over 2.3 million Jews came to the United States. In that same time period, only 167,000 went to the land of Israel. 2.3 here, 167,000 to the land of Israel. Why is this so important? When I would teach students, one of the lessons that I wanted them to take from this was Israel does not exist because Jews were persecuted. Because Jews were persecuted, most left, but those who left chose to come here. For that minority who chose to go to the land of Israel, yes, persecution may have been the push when we talk about the push and pull of immigration, but the pull for that minority to go to the land of Israel was a sense of something different. The sense that Israel is a expression of Jewish sovereignty and self-determination. That in the land of Israel, and only in the land of Israel, and now the state of Israel, were Jews really able to shape their own future. This is, to me, why a relationship with both Israel and Israelis is such an essential part of our work as Jewish Federation and a Jewish community. It's articulated best by Rabbi Susan Silverman, sister of the comedian Sarah Silverman, who says that Israel is the place where Jewish spiritual and social possibilities are endless. The relevance of Jewish teachings and values can be tested on a national front. Through our relationship with Israel, we are able to dream about what an ideal Jewishly based society would look like and then explore that vision. That idealism and inherent optimism that Israel can represent to our children and especially our teenagers are characteristics that will serve them well in life. We are all going to have an opportunity to experience that. You notice that Rabbi Silverman doesn't say Israel's always right, Israel is always perfect. It's that struggle. And the word Israel in Hebrew literally means struggle. It's that struggle to create a society that is Jewishly based, that intrigues me and inspires me as a Jewish leader today. It's also why in the 1920s, when our core partner that we're going to learn a lot about on the trip, the Jewish Agency for Israel, was being formed, that it was essential to the leadership that the Jewish Agency not just represent those who drank the Kool-Aid, but that it included those who were non-Zionists. The head of the World Zionist Organization at that time, Dr. Chaim Weizmann, Israel's first president, believed that in order for a Jewish agency to be truly representative of world Jewry, it needed to include voices and leaders that were unaffiliated with the organization at that time. And they reached out to non-Zionist leaders like Louis Marshall, the American Jewish leader. Israel is not perfect. Its government may often take actions with which we disagree, but understanding that Zionism is really about dreaming about Jewish possibilities and what shaping our own future can look like. I'll just conclude with one of my favorite quotes from one of my favorite Israeli leaders and heroes, David Ben-Gurion, Israel's first prime minister. Ben-Gurion said, "Nobody denies any Jew, wherever they may be, the right to express their opinion and criticize, but an obligation can only be exerted in a mutual way. Can I force Zionists who reside in America to come here any more than they can force me to eat kosher when I don't want to? They can criticize and they can demand, but they cannot compel as I cannot compel them. We cannot compel them other than by moral means, for the sense of belonging to the Zionist movement derives only from such a feeling. Here there is a greater connection, a connection that makes a demand upon a moral basis essential, for we are bound to one another with indissoluble ties. In life and death, and our liability to one another is unlimited. The identification of Zionism with the state, with what is good in it, with what is being accomplished within it, with all its creative activity is necessary without reckoning of how this tie is forged. Even if you do not contribute 1 penny, you have a share in what we are doing here. And by the money you give, you acquire no special prerogatives. It is not money that gains you rights, but ideals. This is a partnership of ideals." And he concludes by saying, "I won't attempt to compose a formula for Zionism, but I'll describe its background. The background is love of Israel, not friends of Israel, not sympathizers with Israel, but love of Israel. Love Israel means love of the state of Israel as a mother loves her child, even if it is naughty, even if it at times does something that is not right. Without love of Israel, there is no Zionism." The work that we do at Jewish Federation, and I believe the impact of this journey for each of you, is to foster that love and help all of us achieve that greater sense of connection and commitment to Israel and the Jewish people. I'll now turn it over to my good friend Eli Sperling, who will talk a little bit about some of that messiness and the political stuff and the demography that's happening today. Thank you.
Thank you to Rabbi Heller, to Joel, and to Rich, and to all of you for having me here today. I think, first of all, I just want to say kol hakavod to all of you. In Hebrew, this means all the honor for deciding to go to Israel. And I think amongst the most important things that we can do in maintaining a connection to Israel is maintaining a connection to the other half of the world's Jews. And so I want to talk a little demography to just think about who American Jews are, who Israelis are, and where we can see some of the differences in these communities as you are preparing to go meet the other half of the world's Jewish population. So, as Rich indicated, millions of Jews came into the United States between 1881 surrounding pogroms, and I will note, prior to 1880, there were only 300,000 Jews in the United States. Most of them were from Germany and left Berlin in the mid-1800s. So, very small population, mostly Republicans, lived in the Midwest. But amidst the pogroms, we had millions of Jews flood from Europe into the United States, mostly from Eastern Europe. Now, the US Congress passed an act in the 1920s called the Johnson-Reed Act. This was enforced until 1952. Has anyone seen the new Ken Burns documentary, The US and the Holocaust? All right, so if you haven't, I highly recommend watching it. They don't talk much about Zionism, but they do talk about many of the immigration issues in the United States that led to a strengthening of Zionism. Since the US in the 1920s basically cut off its immigration until the 50s, our population has been static. Our population came here in that period of the 1800 to 1924-25 time. And we haven't really had a whole lot of shifting since. Obviously, our population's bigger. We're over 6 million now. But our demography, the ethnic groups that came here, the culture, it has remained static. Likewise, our politics. To put this into perspective, in 1932, 85% of American Jews voted for Roosevelt. The lowest Democratic turnout was for Carter at 69%. And to give a more moderate idea of today, 2016, 72% of Jews voted for Hillary Clinton. So we are pretty consistently Ashkenazi, mostly middle to upper middle class, mostly vote left of center, and practice religion in private institutions like this that is part of our tax structure, essentially. In Israel, it is completely different. There have been waves and waves of immigration that have come to Israel since, of course, the 1880s when Zionist immigration started there. But following the founding of the state in 1948, and actually until Johnson-Reed would have theoretically allowed Jews to come to the United States, Israel's population nearly doubled in that period, with Jews from Muslim lands that came from across North Africa and the Middle East. This was a population of Jews that spoke Arabic, referred to God as Allah, much like we say God in English, were more socially conservative, were more religious, were more fiscally conservative, and were not interested in the socialist ideals of the Labor Party, and very quickly formed a social justice movement, in fact, modeled after the American Black Panthers. You all should Google the Israeli Black Panthers in the early 1970s. It is wild, but it is a group of Moroccans that saw the Labor Party, the socialists, as oppressing them. This demographic group allowed for Menachem Begin to win as the first Likud conservative prime minister in 1977. And since then, we have not really had many strong left governments, and we have not had a left of center government in Israel since Ehud Barak lost office in 2000. Now, when we think about that we have not had a left of center government in Israel for 23 years, and we understand that Israeli demography is a little bit more conservative, more religious, and is made up of people that have repeatedly come from areas of oppression, whether it be Jews from Muslim lands escaping oppression in the 50s and 60s, whether it be Jews escaping the Iranian Revolution, whether it be Jews from Ethiopia, Jews from the former Soviet Union, Ukrainian Jews. Today, we have people coming from places of great discomfort, very much in contradistinction to the lives we live. So in understanding Israeli politics, we just have to understand, at least trying to think of it in relation to ourselves, that it is just a very different population of Jews. Half of Israel's Jewish population is of Middle Eastern descent, and 21% of Israel's population are Arab citizens of Israel, Muslims, Christians, Druze. So when we think about the fact that about 66% of Israel is Middle Eastern, we understand why Israel is moving towards a more conservative direction, playing within the politics of its neighborhood. And I encourage you, when you're in Israel, talk to people about how they feel. I guarantee you, when you're in Tel Aviv, speaking to a young person in a coffee shop, they are going to have a very different perspective than a Haredi man that you may meet on public transportation in Jerusalem. And they're certainly going to have a very different perspective than those individuals in Megiddo and Yokneam who are dealing with poverty. And this is the other thing to think about. Israel is a country of Jews. They're rich, they're poor, they're criminals. Jews are across that spectrum, and we have a lot of poverty in Israel that is of great concern to Israeli citizens, and we see people voting for individuals that they think are going to help Israel's economy. We also have a brain drain from Israel. There are roughly 1 million Israelis living in the United States. The Ministry of Foreign Affairs doesn't have exact numbers, but maybe 350,000 plus are undocumented. So to think of hundreds of thousands of undocumented Jewish immigrants living in the United States is quite a unique thing to think about. But we're seeing more Ashkenazi liberal Jews amidst Israel's new, more conservative government, considering their options in coming to the United States. So now that we have a sense of demography and how we have gotten to at least a place within the society where more conservative Jews, more religious Jews just dominate the population and are voting for parties in that interest, it doesn't mean there isn't a left. There's still actually a very robust left. You can see photographs and news stories of them taking to the streets, protesting policies of this government, namely something that we are seeing a lot in the news about an override clause for the Supreme Court. So I will do my best to explain how this works as briefly as possible. And this is another thing I highly recommend talking to people about. Talk to your tour guides, talk to people you meet in the streets. Everyone is going to have a different opinion, and they are Israelis. They have reasons for their opinion. Listen to them. It's the best way to learn. But to understand the brass tacks, Israel is a parliamentary system. There are 120 seats in the parliament, and the executive branch is not like the executive branch of the United States. Benjamin Netanyahu, as the prime minister, is simply the leader of the largest party who successfully put a government together. So in Israel, the executive and the legislature are essentially one and the same. Your prime minister and the executive are working within the government as part of the majority to pass laws. The separation we do have is between the judiciary and the legislature. So the legislature is the Knesset. It is not bicameral. It is just one body. We actually have a lot of Israeli political scientists now suggesting that maybe the Knesset should be split. Many don't want to do that. That would probably make things much messier than they are. But essentially, the Supreme Court is the check to the legislature. The Knesset does not have the ability now to override a ruling of the Supreme Court, which, unlike the United States, can rule on issues that relate to economy, to society, to warfare. So many on the right argue that since objectively, most of those Supreme Court justices sit more to the left than many in Israeli society, that Supreme Court has the ability to impose what they consider to be a liberal agenda on the Israeli people who want to use their elected officials to dictate whether a law will pass or not. Now, of course, in the context of what is considered to be now Israel's most religious and conservative government yet, the fear amongst Israelis on the left and why we see 100,000 plus Israelis going to the streets every weekend is because they feel that the right is trying to hijack the government and impose a much more religious and socially conservative doctrine in the country than they would want. Now, this is complicated. How do we as Americans relate to that? And I will be personal here in bringing up my very regular conversations with my left of center Reform rabbi father. He calls me, I'd say 5 days a week as I'm driving home from campus to complain about something that someone said on the right that he read about in Haaretz, or he watched this video and he was so angry about this politician. And I've kind of had to stop my dad a few times and say, you know, of course I understand passion. I understand that you want to see a different reality in Israel, but you can't vote there. And so what do you want to do? And he's, oh, I don't know. And I'm like, you know, you can go and visit and not agree with the current government, and you don't need to feel bad about that. He's like, okay. And I give him this pep talk about twice a week. So I offer this as a pep talk to you all that no matter what your politics are at home as they relate to Israel, the absolute best thing you can do is just ask Israelis what they think and why. It's the best way to learn. You'll learn a lot more doing that than you will taking my Israeli politics class at the University of Georgia. I assure you. And I encourage my students to study abroad. And actually at UGA, we are running our second annual study abroad trip to Israel. So that's something that is happening for us. And I get to bring UGA students out there. So I think that what is going on now in Israeli politics is for many reasons a shock to American Judaism. And I think it makes sense considering our static demography and worldviews and the very, very non-static, fluid reality of Israeli society and politics, particularly as they are operating in the Middle East. And a final note I'll make as a maybe silver lining to people who may be very concerned about Likud being in office. Likud's done really well with diplomacy. We don't really think about this, but 1979 with Egypt, Yitzhak Rabin had a terrible series of meetings with Ford and then Carter. They hated each other. Begin wasn't really liked by Carter, but he had the pull within the right of the government to convince his colleagues that peace with Egypt was in the strategic interests of Israel. Full stop. 1994, amidst Oslo, Rabin got a peace deal with Jordan in 1994. There had not been another since we have the Abraham Accords come in the summer of 2000. Under a Trump presidency, under Netanyahu, who weeks before had threatened to unilaterally annex the West Bank, we had a landmark peace agreement under a Likud government with 5 Arab states. So what we learn from this is in the neighborhood of the Middle East, a figure like Netanyahu, who is not an ideologue when it comes to regional diplomacy, is maybe even a better partner than the United States. In Egypt in 2012, amidst the Arab Spring, people took to the streets. The regime fought it. They'd been in power since 1952. And what did Barack Obama do? He called for elections. And what happened in those elections? The Muslim Brotherhood won. Immediately there was a coup. The old regime was back in power. US didn't really do anything about it. I think for the Gulf states, they're afraid that the United States will push them towards democracy, which means these kingdoms will have to relinquish control of their oil assets. They don't want to do that. And they have increasing levels of strategic ties with Israel, whether it be technology partnerships, shared defense pacts against Iran. The Emiratis have already invested about $3.5 billion into Israeli natural gas fields. Well, why did Germany capitulate to Russia? They were concerned about their supply of LNG. Israel found a great deal of LNG in the Mediterranean, likewise in Cypriot and Greek waters. We already have memoranda of understanding to pursue a pipeline of LNG to Italy to serve as an alternative to Putin. Now, the Emiratis benefit from being able to leverage global politics, and they're probably going to make a lot of money off of their investments. And we see this across the board in the Arab world, even in Saudi Arabia with no formal ties. Even through intermediaries, they are sinking hundreds of millions of dollars into the Israeli economy. So the region is changing. I think domestic politics in Israel in many ways align with what we could expect from Israeli demography. And in many regards, the fact that the dominant majority of Israelis are Middle Easterners, we can understand a lot of tolerance within these emerging new frameworks for diplomacy that we're seeing. And so too, I urge you to talk to Israelis about their feelings about regional diplomacy. We see a great deal of interest in diplomacy with Arab states, not a lot of interest in diplomacy with the Palestinians for an independent Palestinian state. Ask Israelis why they do not want to vote for an independent Palestinian state, but they don't have a problem with diplomacy with other Arab states. And I'm sure the variation of answers that you will get from people will teach you a lot about how Israelis view diplomacy and the Palestinians. So with that, I will end. I'm sure there are questions. I know Joel is going to come and moderate us, and I think we'll probably stand up here.
Excuse me, you would just before we get started with the questions, I want to acknowledge a couple of special guests here tonight. I want to thank Regions Bank as our corporate sponsor for this trip. And we have two distinguished guests who are also going to be our travel mates. David and Dana Smith, if you would wave just to the audience, we really appreciate it. We look forward to traveling with you both and getting to know you better. And with that, if you've got questions, those in the audience, if you would type them in the chat, and we'll make sure that we get them repeated. And if anybody here has a question that you want to ask any of our speakers, please raise your hand. All right. Questions from the audience? All right. Well, please go ahead.
Question maybe directly to Barry Sports. For those of us who haven't done any international travel in many decades, there may be things that for others who travel routinely, we don't really think of it as second nature that makes staff do. But for those of us who haven't, an example is where you pointed out what you're bringing medications, bring them in the original bottle that show the prescription that you got. That way you're less likely to run into trouble going to customers. But I'm sure that there are other tips again that you may not even consider anymore because it's so routine, but please share those with us who haven't done international travel since day one.
Sure. The question was really one of logistics, and for people who haven't traveled overseas in recent times, what are some travel tips that we can share with our group? And I'll direct that one to Barry, and I'll make sure that is part of the information that's circulated. That, you know,
We have a long agenda. Robin Simpson, one of our co-chairs, is helping draft that agenda. So please come prepared to learn. And if you have questions, you're welcome to email.
right. And what Barry said was on March 20th, either our in-person meeting at the Seelig Center or those that will be attending by Zoom, we'll have some of that information available. But in addition, you know, if you've got questions, specific questions, ask Barry. And if we do put together a sort of high level, you know, for those that haven't traveled in recent years, here's a punch list of some ideas. we'll circulate that to all those that are intending. We've got everybody's email address, and that'll be one way to communicate.
I have kind of an obscure thing that I would throw out there just as something to consider. Israel is extremely tight about taxing things coming into the country. Meaning, if you are going to bring something for an Israeli, if you're asked to bring a laptop or a phone, take it out of the case, have it look like it's yours. Otherwise, they're going to charge you an insane amount of taxes on it. Likewise with bottles of booze. If you buy anything in duty free, you're going to be taxed when you get to Israel. Just as an FYI, it might be cheaper to get those things once you're already in country.
All right, great.
Jennifer, you.
So
Wait a minute, Jennifer, is there a question?
I understand your question.
You know what? We really don't want people making speeches. So
No, I will formulate a question for you. How much of this judicial reform that we see on the table is related to protecting Netanyahu? Is that the question? Okay. So the answer is, to Netanyahu, that is the number one concern. To the actual ideological right, they will burn Netanyahu as fast as they can. They want judicial reform to enforce issues of religiosity, to prevent young Haredi men from having to serve in the military, maybe to get rid of a potential egalitarian prayer space. There is a genuine ideologue agenda amongst the far right. Netanyahu is just trying to find those who would support him. And I would say that if it was a left-wing bloc that would keep him out of jail, if he would pass if he was going to capitulate to their agenda, he would be happy to bend to the left.
Right. Because Netanyahu, as Eli is saying, is much more ideologically aligned politically with the opposition, with former Prime Minister Lapid, with Benny Gantz. But because of Netanyahu's insistence, Jennifer, as you're saying, and Netanyahu's insistence, that's created like, we won't sit with you. So like if we were to map all of the Israeli political parties on a spectrum, it's shocking that those parties that are grouped together, and in fact, some of them broke away from Likud to form because of personality issues, which is like another dimension in Israeli politics. So sometimes what's ideologically best doesn't align with maybe personally best. And so I think that's what we're seeing play out. And by the way, it's likely, and it really explains why Israel's had so many elections over the last few years, because governments that are formed on very little ideological footing just aren't destined to last very long. Very.
I would say, so the question was, since I encouraged people to ask Israelis questions, even personal ones, how amenable are they to answering you? I would say much more than you would expect. And in fact, I would say that they will be happy to talk about it. I think a lot of Americans go out there and don't ask Israelis what they think. And I think generally as Jews, we can assume we all like to talk, but Israelis love to talk politics. And as long as you're listening and not telling them what you think, you'll learn a lot. And I would say across the board, unless someone's busy or just particularly rude, most Israelis will be much more willing to talk politics than anyone in America. And they will be shockingly honest, maybe even uncomfortably.
Being direct is one of the big cultural differences between Israelis and Americans.
Just to put it into context, one of the first questions I'm asked when I meet new Israelis is how much I get paid. So yeah, few boundaries.
With the fall of the government, is that caused some of the investment in Israel, American companies that have invested in Israel pull out?
Yeah, so this is actually something I wanted to touch on. I didn't have time to. The question was, is there a potential economic impact to Israel by way of and I would say you asked American companies, I'm just going to say global companies, because
Israeli companies too.
Israeli companies, European companies, American companies, maybe some Chinese companies, because of this conservative direction. Now, I was actually reading today, many financial analysts just bluntly say yes. And I'll give an analogy to Atlanta. There were some local state legislations passed relating to things that Delta and certain Netflix studios were not happy about. When they threatened to pull those dollars out, that changed the attitudes of certain members of the Republican Party in Georgia, and we saw some reversals. We see many folks in Tel Aviv, particularly in the tech sector, as a mode of protest and just a cautionary call saying, if you go the route that you want and truly make the country legally bound to these ideological codes, you are going to lose Israeli companies, you are going to lose talent to America and Europe, you're going to lose European companies, and you're going to lose clients. And I think that's very palpable. I think that economic impact could be something that may reverse course, although we don't know.
We have time for 2 more questions.
Do you think that it's the role of the U.S. government, president, et cetera, put pressure on Israel not to make judicial changes that underscore democracy? And I'm curious if you think that, that they're trying to put pressure. Anyone?
Yeah.
Look, I would say, and Eli, the question was, do we think it's the role of an American government to put pressure on Israel when it disagrees with its policies? Look, I think America and Israel first of all, have a very special, long-standing relationship. Goes back to even before the existence of the state of Israel. There's obviously, mutual benefits to that relationship. And I think just like the United States would do with other allies, the United States can certainly take that role. I think the question is whether or not Israel has a duty or an obligation to respond to it. And I think we're seeing, in cases where it's going to benefit Israel, according to Israel's leaders, they'll listen. And in cases where they don't think it's going to benefit them, they won't. Yeah, but a lot of that pressure is mutually beneficial. So it could ultimately hurt America. So I know a lot of people like to harp on, the dollars for military investment. Most of those dollars are spent back in American military technology. So ultimately it bounces back and hurts the United States. It's really those investments are to ensure Israel's, qualitative military edge in the region, but it's based on a shared interest, because it's in the United States' interest that Israel, because if Israel doesn't have the military edge in the region, well, guess who will? Iran. And the United States doesn't want that either. So the United States has to be very careful where it exerts its pressure and, where it can play some of those cards.
Last question for the night.
Did you want to add anything?
Absolutely.
Yep.
So
Repeat the question.
the question was, how can we better understand the Palestinian situation and evolving violence? I don't know if anyone saw in the news today, but we had Israeli operations in the West Bank, which have been quite commonplace over the past weeks. So there are a few million Palestinians in the West Bank living under Israeli control. There are a couple million Palestinians living in Gaza, not under Israeli control. They are under Hamas control. The Palestinian Authority is the de facto government of the Palestinians that was established in the Oslo period, meaning when Clinton was negotiating between the head of the PLO, Yasser Arafat, and Yitzhak Rabin between 93 and 95. The Palestinian Authority was created out of the PLO. Now, they still control the West Bank. However, in 2007, following the last election we've had in the Palestinian territories, Hamas won the most seats. They were not actually granted the seats that they won. The PA just maintained control. And in 2007, there was a war. Hamas staged a coup, kicked the PA out of Gaza, and we've been having wars and rocket attacks since. So we need to look at the Palestinians as two separate political entities, at least, those in Gaza not under any Israeli control, and those in the West Bank under Palestinian Authority control. Now, We were supposed to have elections a year and a half ago. They didn't happen. They were supposed to happen again 6 months ago. They didn't happen. And we have gotten to a point where internally Palestinian politics are so messy that we can't have a cooperation agreement between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority. And we know, at least based on polling, that in an election, Hamas would win. No one wants Hamas to win. Hamas wants Hamas to win. Many Palestinians want them to, but most countries in the Middle East, the United States, Europe, the global community don't. So to think of a very conservative Middle Eastern state, the Saudis. The Saudis' official position right now is that because the Palestinians are unable to form any political consensus and form a functioning parliament that could serve as an institution to build a state off of, that they are essentially abandoning pressuring the Israelis to sit at the negotiating table and are encouraging the Israelis to move forward in bilateral negotiations with other Arab states, not mentioning the Palestinians at all. And if you read the Abraham Accords and the bilateral negotiations, there are a couple ceremonial mentionings of the Palestinians, but what has basically happened is the Arab world, except for Lebanon, Syria, Iran, and the Houthis, proxies of Iran, support the Palestinian cause, will fight for it, and the rest of the states have found an interest in looking inward towards national interest in partnering with Israel. So I would say the Abraham Accords are probably the most exciting achievement for Israel and the most detrimental move in the progression towards an independent Palestinian state. It's not a happy outlook for the Palestinians, but the Arab world and the Israelis have decided that the status quo is easier to deal with and better for the region at this point.
Thank you very much. Please join me in thanking our speakers tonight. Very informative, very substantive. I think the most insightful comment made tonight was ask an Israeli, and if you're serious about intent on listening, be prepared for a response. There'll be a lot more information available on March 20th. Please check your emails. Additional information will be provided. I want to thank Rabbi Heller again and everyone at B'nai Torah for hosting us. And our program is concluded. Please enjoy a little coffee outside and visit with some of your fellow attendees. Thank you. Thank you, Robin.